Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content. We are back with another live episode, and today we've got an interesting game to talk about. We've got the Dallas Mavericks versus the Minnesota Timberwolves game one. Very interesting game, I think. And we've also got some All NBA stuff to discuss as well, and some previews at the end of the episode
Yeah,
to
so we
close out.
see so we see the Homelander already in the chat. Fluka Doncic rooting for Mini because of what they did to my boys. Need Ant to bounce back and pop off. So game one, Dallas takes 108-105. Pretty back and forth competitive game. Um, where Minnesota for most of the first half had the upper hand. Dallas in the second half had the upper hand, right? And neither team ever went up by that much. And I thought from both teams' perspectives, this was kind of, if you're Dallas, this is kind of I guess, the roadmap to beat Minnesota, right? Where you have Luka and Kyrie taking advantage of their matchups, right? Where, obviously, like we said, we knew what was going to happen. You were going to have McDaniels on Luka. You were going to have Edwards on Kyrie, right? And obviously if you had heard going into the series, right, Edwards was talking about, the matchup against Kyrie. And Kyrie took that seriously, as Michael Jordan once said. And he kind of was the catalyst in the first half, right? He finished with 30 points, four assists, 5 rebounds, no threes, interestingly enough, but still over 50 from the field, 12 of 23 from the field, right? A lot of drives, a lot of mid ranges, which was kind of really the theme for Dallas for most of the game, right? Because if you look at the 3-point shooting Ant sold tonight, that was one of the reasons. But we'll get to the rest of it as well. You look at Dallas, 6 of 25 from three, but still 49 from the field, 16 of 17 at the line. And then, you look over at Minnesota, 18 threes, 18 of 49, right? So, a good amount of threes. Obviously, it's not, 45% from the three, but that's still really good, right? Like, that's such a massive advantage. I mean, you're talking about 12 more threes. That's over 36 points just from the three alone. But then obviously you look around and then, let's see. You look at Jaden McDaniels, 9 of 15 from the field, 6 of 9 from three. He was kind of a catalyst in the first half, but then you saw in the second half, especially Tyree is so tough. Respect his craft. Yeah, exactly. I mean, at his craft. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a lot of really tough shot making from Dallas. And this is the roadmap to win because, for Minnesota, as great as their defense is, kind of like Denver, some of those guys are good at making tough shots. But the difference is for Dallas is the rim protection and the rebounding is really good, right? Like Denver's a very good rebounding team, but they don't have quite as much athleticism as Dallas does. And obviously Dallas has better rim protection, even though the perimeter defense is a little bit questionable at times. But even guys like Luka and Kyrie locked in on defenses, especially Luka in the second half, right? Where he's, intercepting lob passes, and just getting into, areas and passing lanes. So, really good game from the stars. Like I said, Kyrie in the first half, Luka in the second half. The role players for Dallas is kind of interesting, right? Because PJ Washington, he didn't shoot 50% from three in this game, right? He shot 25. He made a big one late in the game, but he shot 8 and only made 2 of them. And then Derrick Jones Jr., right, got to the rim, but, 0 of 2 from three. But then, unlike in the first two rounds, right, Luka and Kyrie together were much better than they normally were in the previous two rounds. Then you got Lively off the bench, who played, very well, plus 19 in the minutes he played, 9 points, 11 rebounds, 2 blocks. But, other than that, off the bench, Green didn't do a whole lot. He made a big three at one point. Jaden Hardy, but really it was more so the starters plus Lively in this game. And then, you look over at Minnesota, a lot of threes, but defensively, this is why Dallas is a different matchup compared to Denver because of the fact that even though they're not going to play through the post like Denver can, right? Denver, in terms of their execution, is pretty good, but Dallas has a different type of game, right? Where it's like, and this was a game where they didn't even make that many threes, but they just have so much more threat in terms of ball handling, right? It's two guys, but it's two guys that Denver doesn't have, right? Because, Kyrie is better than Jamal Murray. I don't think that's a hot take. I think that's, a pretty reasonable assumption. And then you have Luka, right? Who, is, 2 years younger, 2 years older, 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 2 in the top 5, right? Like, most people would have Jokic as the best, but Luka's in the top 5. Um, and that's going to be a really interesting key in this series because, say, like an Edwards, right? He's been like a top 5 guy in the playoffs, even though you may not necessarily say he's a top 5 NBA player. And he wasn't great in this game. He hit some big threes. He was 5 of 12 from three, but he was 6 of 16 from the field, right? So pretty much everything else other than threes was a miss, right? Five of his six makes were threes. And then, he was good on the boards with 11 rebounds and 8 assists, but I thought defensively he didn't play as well in this game. And, like both, it didn't matter the matchup, right? Because Kyrie was the main matchup. It didn't really work out. Luca, sometimes he would get switched on to him. Didn't really work out either, which you don't really want him on Luca anyways because of the size factor. Um, but interestingly enough, there were guys that didn't. Ant got cooked. Yeah, he did. Um, but then there were other guys from Minnesota that honestly were probably better than they were in the Denver series, right? Like Kyle Anderson was atrocious against the Nuggets, right? But against Dallas, at least tonight, he made them pay, right? He only made 1 3, but he got to certain spots that for whatever reason he couldn't get to against the Nuggets. But it's like, hey, we'll live with Kyle Anderson taking 8 shots, right? We'll live with Nikhil Alexander taking 6 shots, and he's 1 for 6, 0 of 4 from 3. And for Minnesota, those guys have to make those shots, but they still shot pretty well from 3. I think in this game, the defense was a big problem for Minnesota, right? And some of it was like there were some possessions where there was really good defense and guys made tough shots, like Luca in the fourth. Yeah, I mean, like he had the contested step back 3
Mhm.
over Edwards, a couple of step backs over Jaden McDaniels, who's a much taller player. But that guy's incredible at getting to his spots and being able to score. It's a tough matchup, right? It may be, and this is kind of the issue for a team like Minnesota, where it's like you're built to beat a team like Denver, but are you built to beat a team like Dallas, right? Like they can still win the series. It's game 1. So you don't overreact to a game 1 loss. But obviously if you're Dallas, you're feeling good because you won game 1 on the road. Minnesota's very good at home, even though they lost to Denver in the last series. But we know they're very good at home. Um and it was a game where Dallas shot really poorly from 3. Wolves let the horses out of the barn. I mean, I don't think they gave the game away. I mean, I think Dallas, again, remember, just like the Nuggets, Dallas is also a very good crunch time team, especially offensively, right?
Mhm.
Because they have 2 guys that can pretty much get shots whenever and wherever they want. And that is going to be a problem, I think, for Minnesota, where it's tough because let's say if Luca and Kyrie play in the pick and roll, if you switch, right, and you get, Gobert or Towns, switched on to Luka or Kyrie, okay, well, that they like that matchup if you're the guards, right? Because you can take those guys off the dribble, even though those guys, make a good effort, to kind of stay in front. But then if don't, right, and something else happens, right, they could also quickly throw the lob. So, you kind of have to pick your poison in terms of how to guard them. And, Dallas, hung in there, because it wasn't like they were up the whole game. But this is kind of a roadmap where if it's a close game, kind of like what would happen with the Nuggets usually win those type of close games. But for Dallas, they're going to pull it out. But if you're Minnesota, Edwards, you have to be better because you can't be 6 for 16. It's funny because they beat Denver in game 7 with Edwards not having a good shooting game. He did other stuff, right? He defended, but didn't defend well in this game, and then obviously didn't give you much on offense. So he has to be better on both ends of the floor. Towns was 6 for 20, right? Which is funny because it felt like he was playing a good game. I didn't really realize he was shooting 6 for 20.
Yeah.
He was 2 of 9 from 3, right? So, and a couple of those threes were, like,
Horrible
oh,
shots, double
yeah,
teamed threes,
yeah,
but
exactly. And even a couple that he made, like he made the deep one.
yeah, that was
And I
OC.
think he had like kind of a tough one in the corner. So most of his shots were kind of tough-ish shots. Um, Gobert plus 10, which is the funny thing, because I think a lot of people would probably say that Gobert kind of mucked up the offense at times. But again, like the offense, I don't think was as much of the problem. I think more so of the problem was Dallas was scoring pretty effectively, and that's kind of tough for Minnesota because, again, they're a defensive-oriented team, kind of like Dallas, but Dallas has a higher offensive ceiling than, or I guess both a higher offensive floor and ceiling than Minnesota.
Mhm.
So for Minnesota, they're going to have to, find a way to kind of figure out the Kyrie Luka stuff. But it's the tough part because, again, it's a very different team from Denver, and this is where in the playoffs, Wolves have to stop the lobs. But I don't know how great they're going to be at cutting those off, right? Because like you could have McDaniels, I guess, drop back and try to, kind of take away the lobs. But again, the problem is that if you play drop, then what's going to happen, right? Kyrie and Luca are going to get to their spots, and they're going to be, and they don't have to hit from three in order to score. And Denver didn't have to hit from threes in order to score, but again, they're a guard oriented team, so
Yeah.
that's the tough part. So if Dallas kind of consistently gets quality offense, then they're probably going to win because their defensive ceiling I think is higher than Denver's because I just think they have a lot more rim protection and rebounding, so they can kind of afford to they can kind of afford to do some things that Denver couldn't do defensively. And also, like, if Luka's the best player in the series, then it's probably a wrap anyways, right? Because then, unless Kyrie's just bad, he's probably going to be not much worse than 3, right? Because I think he's going to outplay Towns probably in this series. Because I think Dallas has more size and rim protection to kind of deter the Minnesota bigs. Even though I liked some of the stuff they were doing, like Towns was throwing some lobs to Gobert, right? He had a couple of assists, and that's tough, right? Because you do have to keep a guy like Gobert involved on offense. Because if he's not, right, then that's where it's going to be really clunky. But again, it's just kind of interesting because in terms of the plus minuses, he was good. Naz Reid felt like he had a good game. He was -11. And that's the tough part is if Gobert's not out there, you don't have as much defensive resistance, right? Because he's by far the best defensive rim protector on the Wolves, right? But if it's a scenario where, they're not really going to be able to get stops, then they might not be able to win the series. Because that's how they were able to beat the Nuggets, was they were able to slow down their offense. And then they turn, the Nuggets, lack of offense, and they turn their defense into their own offense.
Right.
But again, it's a different animal, right? Like I would say the Nuggets are still a better team than Dallas, but I think Dallas matches up better with Minnesota than Denver does. And that's a scenario where we both have Minnesota in 7. So it's game 1. So it doesn't mean that this series is over. It's just not an ideal scenario to start, right? Because obviously we know Denver lost the first 2 games to the Wolves at home, right? And then they ended up losing the series, right? So if you're Minnesota, I think game 2 you kind of have to win. It doesn't mean that you're 100% going to lose the series, but that's what happened to Denver because in general you have to win 4 out of 5. Looked like they were going to win game 7 because they were up 20, but who knows? Also, like maybe Minnesota after a tough game 7 series against the Nuggets, maybe they came into the series a little bit fatigued and gassed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Dallas, they went 6, right? But that series had a lot more swings in it than the Nuggets series, right? Even though again a lot of the Nuggets games were blowouts and the Dallas games were closer, it's just a little bit different, right? It's just a
Sure.
lot different in terms of what was going on. So, we'll see. But if you're Dallas, this is kind of a best case scenario, right? Where it's like just like, if Indiana had pulled off the game 1 upset, not that they win the series, but it's always better to steal game 1 on the road and then worst case scenario split or best case scenario, go back home up 2-0. Because if they go back home up 2-0, they're probably going to win the series.
Right. And, there's a couple of things, probably 3 things that I want to talk about in regards to this game. I think, you look at Kyrie, I think he was like a huge catalyst for this game being won. For him doing everything possible to really try and keep the Mavs alive, I think, in the first quarter.
Yeah.
And then also just attacking in the first half, which is kind of the exact opposite of what we kind of seen from him throughout the majority of the postseason. And then Luka coming alive in the fourth quarter and the second half really was amazing as well. And I think that kind of shows how versatile both these guys can be together. That's why I'm very surprised that Minnesota really dropped this game, just because of the difference in the attack that we saw. Another thing, the 3-pointers versus the points in the paint is disgusting.
Yeah.
If you look at it, Dallas, they outscored Minnesota 62-38 in the paint. Like, there was no paint defense really from Minnesota, and that's tough to ask because, you're playing drop coverage. Luka gets a lot of buckets in the paint. Kyrie as well. Obviously, the lobs. So it's tough. But, you look at Minnesota's offense, and like you were talking about, it was not horrible. I think we've seen worse from them overall.
Yeah.
You look at the Stars' shooting percentages okay, cool. But a lot of other guys had some very good, shooting splits because, you look at their 3 point percentage, they made 18 threes, shot 36% from the 3 point line. That's not horrible. 42% from the field, but I think that's just due to the high volume of misses from really Towns and Edwards. But
And Dallas's defense was good.
sure, yeah, they limited Edwards, and I think Edwards is like Reggie Miller said, I think about a million times, very very tired. He's very gassed, and as he should be. If he's exerting a lot of energy on both ends of the floor, one of the two is going to suffer, and both of them actually suffered this game in terms of his offense and his defense.
And again, just a quick note before you go, then
Sure.
adding on to the rim protection again, as I mentioned, 12 of Edwards' 16 shots were threes.
Hmm.
That's a very high percentage of 3-point shots in terms of his offense. Not that he's not because he made 40% of them, right? He shot
Right.
5 of 12. But if you're Dallas, you'll live with Edwards taking like 75% of his shots from three. Because against the Nuggets, yeah, he hit some threes, but he also punished them around the basket, right?
100%.
And he only got the free throw line once, right? And that's because he shot 12 threes. So I mean, like
Right.
that's the other factor as well. Whereas like against the Nuggets, Jokic, unless he, doesn't have any fouls, he's not going to provide quite as much resistance at the rim. Gordon can defend, but he's not a center, right?
Yeah.
But whereas, like with the Mavs, their interior defense is a lot different than Denver's. And again, Denver's a very good defensive team, but Dallas has been the best defensive team since the trade deadline, especially with that starting five too.
Yeah, and I mean, that your point is quite literally proven also by the previous series between Dallas and Oklahoma City. Look at what they were able to do to Oklahoma City and make them really run them off the floor, and make them attempt a lot of threes. And it's like at the end of the day, you want Oklahoma City would want that amount of threes. Wolves will bounce back. They have another one at home, most likely. They need to bounce back, I would say. But
Yeah,
because
again,
what's up?
yeah, because I mean, you also have to factor with Dallas winning game one. Maybe they might. I don't know. I don't want to say ease up, but you know what I mean. Like like there's a difference between one team being more desperate than the other. Where like Minnesota is going to have to go into game two thinking like we have to win this game because if we don't win this game, then we're probably going to lose the series. Like
Right.
obviously you could go into Dallas and steal a Dallas game because I think that's probably what will happen. That's part of why I think it will go to 7. But again, I agree with the Homelander where I think the Wolves will bounce back, but they do have to kind of probably change up some stuff too. Because the worst part is that what if there's a game like last series where like Luka and Kyrie are okay, but then like PJ Washington has like a huge 3-point shooting game, right? Because he was 2 for 8, but he shot like 50 from 3 in that previous round. Or even like somebody just off the bench all of a sudden has like a big stretch, from the perimeter in like a 5-minute stretch.
Yeah, and I actually liked what Minnesota did against Derek Jones Jr. and PJ Washington. I thought they kind of did a good job of kind of giving them kind of shots that you would want them to take,
And that's what
and
OKC
being
did.
yeah, and being realistic about it. But obviously it's going in the favor
Right.
of Minnesota. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, when you do that and you're still kind of getting torched by Kyrie and Luka, then I think you have an issue where you probably have to switch up some matchups or just hope that your guys potentially play better. My last point that I wanted to talk about, free throws. At the end of the day, I know it's kind of a cliche stat, but Minnesota, they missed 7, Dallas only missed 1. You look at the game split, 108 to 105, winnable game for Minnesota if you just make your free throws, if you want me to be honest.
Fair, I think some of that was Gobert missed 2,
Mm-hmm.
Conley missed 2, but that was at the end of the game when it was kind of over and he choked on the second
Sure.
one. And then he had to miss the third one on purpose. And then Naz Reid missed 2. So like in the real part of the game, they missed 4
Sure.
free throws, right? And like that could have been a difference, just like, and again, because this was a close game, so
Yeah.
anything that can impact the game on either end of the floor is huge, right? Like say Towns going for the putback, that was rough, right? Because it was a 3, didn't look like it was going in, but it bounced up and in, but then he ended up touching it as it was gonna fall in, and then instead of it being a 3, and the Wolves I think would have been up by 1, instead it's nothing. It's basically a turnover.
Yeah.
And then Dallas has the ball, with a chance to score. So, we'll see. Like Minnesota, like I think they will bounce back. It's just tough because again, like if this is a series where Luka and Kyrie pretty much get whatever they want, That's gonna be tough. I mean, like, because like obviously, like those guys are good enough where they're gonna be able to win you games because of them just being able to kind of putting the team on their backs, right? Because this wasn't a game where a bunch of Dallas's role players were amazing. Like, they were okay in spots, right? Like Gafford at 10 and 9, but he was minus 15,
Hmm.
right? In basically what a 3-point game. Derek Jones Jr. -8 in a 3-point game. But then, even although to be fair, Luca -9 in a 3-point game, but we know in the fourth quarter, right, that was where he had his value, right? He had 15 in the fourth, 5 of 8 from the field, 2 of 3 from three, 3 rebounds, 2 steals, and a block. So Luca's fourth quarter was kind of the difference between Dallas probably losing this game by a few points versus winning the game. Kyrie and Luca are great together. And this was kind of the point that we made in our last podcast episode where the Kyrie trade has now been really validated, right? Now, to be fair, Dallas was kind of fortunate that because of Kyrie's situation, they were able to buy low. But this is also kind of an example of why you always kind of bank on the talent because Kyrie is an incredibly talented player. And he's also played with other stars before. So you kind of assume that he can find a way to make it work, and you can also see like, hey, this is a guy that's done a lot of good things, in big moments,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like, you can see him sometimes playing defense. Like you said, you saw him pick his spots in this game, right? Taking over in the first half for the most part, making smart plays for a good chunk. And then, also for Dallas, like you get rewarded by going all in at the deadline, right? And that's kind of all these teams that, went all in at different points, right? Like Boston went all in last summer, right? Indiana went big at the deadline. Dallas did at the deadline. And then Minnesota, I guess, last year, right? But you can make the case that none of those teams would be here if they didn't make those moves.
Right.
But it's interesting, right? 'Cause even then, you usually don't win, a series like, you usually don't get to the finals and win the title by doing what Dallas did, right? Like usually it would be a situation like Minnesota where you were consistently good the whole year. Maybe you do something relatively small and then you pull it out and win. But again, it's still only game one. But that's the interesting part, is that like with the Kyrie and Luca fit, it's seamless and they put better talent around them compared to last season, right? Where like last season, you had Kyrie and Luca, but it's still like an offensive team that doesn't have a lot of size, doesn't have a lot of defense, doesn't have a lot of rebounding or athleticism. But now this time around, they got athletes, they have defense, rebounding, and size. So now the Mavs can win, these kind of like grinded out lower scoring affairs. This one wasn't quite that, but we've seen them be able to win like ugly games, right?
Yeah.
Because you have a floor on offense that's going to be better than some other teams, right? Like Dallas's offensive floor is higher than Minnesota's because we know Minnesota during the regular season was 16th in offensive rating. Their offense has been better in the postseason, for sure, and part of that's because of Edwards. But then you also have to factor in like, okay, what if a team like Dallas defensively or on offense kind of gives some problems to a team like Minnesota? Because if Minnesota doesn't defend, they're not going to be able to win a series because they're a
Right.
defense first team, right? Like Dallas, you could say is a defense first team because their defense, in terms of their defensive rating, is better. But because of the superstar offensive talent they have that Minnesota doesn't have, that's where it might get tough. So I
Yeah.
think if you're Minnesota, if it's like an ugly game, they're probably going to win just because their defense at its core is probably a little bit better. But also at the same time, like Dallas can really defend their butts off too. So that they're gonna have to make some adjustments in terms of trying to slow down Kyrie and Luca. But I don't know. It's tough because if you play them one on one, depending on the matchup, they're gonna score.
Yeah.
But if you double and blitz and trap them, they're either gonna throw lobs or they're gonna kick to those open shooters. But so far in this game, those guys haven't really made them pay, and that's kind of something that I'm curious to look for because over the course of the series, are guys like Washington and Jones Jr. Are those guys going to start hitting the shots that they weren't making in this game? Because if they do, then that's where that becomes a problem. But that's the tough part about the playoffs in general is you have to pick your poison. You
Yeah.
kind of have to give up something. At
And
least we don't have. Oh my goodness! Welcome in, James Wiseman fan. um, at least we don't have. Okay, Siebert. All right. I mean, I don't
oh
know. I
my
mean, like
god.
I don't even know how to respond to that one. But welcome, James Wiseman fan.
I mean, I
Um,
wouldn't have minded that series if I'm
yeah,
being honest.
I mean, at the end of the day, like, you know, we're probably at a point now where it feels like that the top 4 teams in the West are probably the ones that we've seen, from the second round. Obviously, like, and I don't even want to think about next year right now, but like, there's always going to be a team that's swapped out because of injuries or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
Milwaukee was pretty good at different points, but obviously they had some bad injury luck this year, right? So you swap them out, right? Miami was in the finals one year, right? But who knows if they come back. So either way, this should be a good series. I feel like this series is probably going to be better than the Indiana Boston one. Although, again, Indiana can still put up a fight.
That was a
it's
thriller
just
of a game. It was just
yeah,
stupid.
I know it was just so brutal to see Indiana just poop the game away down the stretch. I
Yeah.
mean, like, and we talked about it in the last live stream. That was just
Yeah.
abysmal. And like, it's bad when the coach is like, "My bad, I'm sorry," and it's like, yeah, it is your bad. You lost the game because I mean, like, all they had to do was call even other than the foul, just call a timeout, right? Like,
Right.
as opposed to kind of giving to chance, like, let's throw the ball in bounds and see what happens. Like, no, like, just call. They had, I think, 2 timeouts. There was no reason to not use it.
Yeah.
And instead of being up, because they would have won that game if they had called a timeout and gone to the line. Like,
100%.
I'm sorry, like, yeah, like they were up, I think 3. They would have won that game. But
Yeah.
hey,
Sell
shoulda,
job.
woulda, coulda. Yeah, that game is done. So obviously, their game 2 is tomorrow at 8 o'clock. But yeah, what a series with Minnesota and Dallas, right? Like,
Yeah.
but
A
again,
great
the
opener.
reason,
Sets the
yeah, the
tone.
reason why, yeah, the reason why we think it's gonna be a 7-game series is because of the fact that I think both of these teams are very good. Um, and the things that they're best at, are amongst the best in the league, right? Because again,
Yeah.
Minnesota had the number 1 defense pretty much all year. Dallas had the number 1 defense post trade deadline, and then offense, they're a top 10 offense, right? So that's something that is kind of interesting to see. And again, they're so different in terms of how they play. Because Dallas has bigs, but they don't play through their bigs, right? Like they're not like they don't have like a Towns type of big where like, oh, you can run them through the post or you can have them in the pick and pop or pick and roll. Like, it's a little bit different. So
Yeah.
either way, like I'm just curious to see how Minnesota responds in game 2 because I just feel like with Edwards, if you're going to take 12 threes, I think the defense is going to live with that. Even though he's a very good 3-point shooter, you'd rather that if you're Dallas than him just burning you around the basket because like that's if he gets to the rim, probably close to
I
automatic.
mean, they're
Although
giving him
to
the
be
Shea
fair,
treatment. Like, that's how they
yeah,
guarded Shea.
yeah, but like but again, to be fair, Dallas can kind of afford to do stuff like that because they have more rim protection than Denver. At least we don't have a Detroit versus Boston series. Oh my goodness, uh, that would be
Wait, is he a Detroit
that would.
fan or a Warriors fan?
I thought the Wiseman fan said he was a Warriors fan.
Ooh.
I
I don't know
think.
what's worse. Well, no, Detroit's
Well, we
really
had
pretty
well, we
bad,
had
bro.
Warriors Celtics a couple seasons ago. We know
Yeah,
how that went.
that didn't go very good, dude.
Not for Boston, but I mean,
Yeah.
it went well for Golden State.
Mm-hmm.
So, but either way, I mean, but again, this is kind of the cool part about the playoffs is that like this is where the superstars shine, and this is where you get to see the adjustments. And I think they kind of had an interesting point where they talked about Chris Finch isn't at the wheel all the time, right? It's Micah Nori who's like the lead assistant that's kind of leading the ship, and he's keep in mind we've heard his name tied to some potential coaching gigs, right? So like, could this be like a potential audition to kind of see what he would look like as a head coach? I don't know. Kind of
That would
some
be
interesting.
interesting. I mean, so
Stu-
far I've seen some good stuff from him,
Mhm.
and I've also seen some really questionable things. But
It's
at the
like a
end of the
mixed.
day, yeah. But at the end of the day,
Yeah,
it's kind of what you would expect for a guy who
yeah.
doesn't have any head coaching experience.
Right. James Wiseman fan said stupid. Stupid. What?
I think he's talking to Homelander about the blunder about him being a
Oh,
Warriors fan. I think, but I can't speak for the guy.
yeah, maybe. But yeah. So I mean, like, I guess in terms of like an X factor for Minnesota, I mean, like, obviously the big key is Edwards needs to be better. But
Hmm.
is there like somebody else on the Wolves that you're kind of looking at where it's like maybe they need to step up a little bit more? I mean, like
Can
I
I
don't
say
know because like
this?
Conley. You said who?
I was gonna say, can I say this? I
You
think
sure?
if Jaden McDaniels plays how he did on offense throughout the entire series like this, and you get a good games from Ant-Man, and Carl Anthony Towns, I think that's the series right there. Obviously,
Yeah,
you do have to worry
yeah,
about defense, but offensively, if
yeah,
Jaden McDaniels can show up like that, golden.
yeah. Because I think I saw a stat where when McDaniel scores like over 20 points, they're 18-7, including
Yeah.
regular season and playoffs, which means it
Mm.
hasn't happened a lot. But when they do, but when they do, when it happens, they win. But now I guess they're 18-8.
Yeah.
Although what did he end up? Yeah, he ended up finishing with more than 20. Yeah, 24. So, but I guess the other concern would be, you know, again, like, do you want him taking that many shots? I mean, I guess it's like, if they're open, yeah. It's just kind of interesting because you saw Dallas adjust. Um,
Poverty. Warriors aren't poverty, man. Let's be
oh,
smart here.
but uh, it's kind of funny though, because like when you're just watching, these teams play, it's just kind of wild. But like you said, to be fair with McDaniel's, like when he was open, he took advantage. And I think it's just kind of wild how these swings happen in the postseason because remember, they showed the graphic in game 6 against the Nuggets where he was shooting 38% from the field
Right.
against the Nuggets. But then in game 6 and 7, he has like 20 plus points or a piece, excuse me. Uh, and then in this game, he continues, but then they ended up losing. But
Yeah.
like you said, if Edwards bounces back, and McDaniels, because again, if McDaniels gives you like close to 20 points with a good Edwards Towns game, yeah, like that's where you're gonna win.
Yeah.
Because that's the weak spot for Minnesota is the offense. But if you have a couple of guys that you don't necessarily expect to score a ton, and they start knocking down shots, then that's gonna be huge for Minnesota. It's
Yeah.
just again, if you're Dallas, you can also make the case that like technically Luca and Kyrie could be a little better, right? Because they were a combined 3 of 13 from three. They could have a game where they both get hot from three. You could have a game where the role players for Dallas, like PJ Washington or Derek Jones Jr., play a little bit better. But again, the fact that it was such a close game, I think to me would kind of suggest like these two teams are pretty good. Like maybe we'll see a blowout in one of these games. But yeah, yeah, these guys are having a blast in the chat. But either way, like the fact that it's a close competitive game, like bodes well, I think. I think both teams can I think Minnesota shouldn't look at this game and be like, this is bad. Like, well, not that it's bad that you lost, not that it's good that you lost, but I don't think you look at this game as a game where it's like, we have no chance. Like, there are other things you can do. And like again, he lost by 3. Now, to be fair, it wasn't really 3, right? Because of the free throws or whatever weird situation at the end. But
Yeah.
but I think there's things that Minnesota can do because we already talked about it, right? Like you're just gonna have to have a better offensive game from your stars because in a game where Dallas' stars badly outplayed Minnesota stars, that shouldn't happen. But then you also kind of wonder from Dallas's perspective, aren't our 2 stars probably better when you think about it?
Yeah.
Like I mean that because that's kind of the other thing that you have to factor in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the
I-
star talent is for sure better, and they proved it, in this game. Like, we got to think about it. Luka's been here before. Kyrie has obviously been here before. Ant-Man and Towns have never been in this situation before. As great as they
Even
have played
yeah,
through,
as great as they
yes, as great as they've played, as great as they have been through the postseason, you really can't count out experience. Like that stupid commercial the ESPN airs where the guy's like, it's the playoffs.
yeah,
It's the
oh my goodness.
playoffs.
Yeah, I hate that commercial.
I know it's so stupid.
Yeah, but that's something that because when you think about it, and again, that last series was very close as well. 7-game series, 20-point game comeback in the second half. But in that series, right? Like Edwards, even though he wasn't great in Game 7, right? If you kind of like look at it from a whole, like he played pretty on par with Jokic for most of that series,
Yeah.
right? And you have Towns, who was probably better than Murray, right? And for most of that series, right? So you have Edwards and Jokic being pretty close, and then Towns edging out Jamal Murray.
Yeah.
But this time around is Luca, right? Again, very different player from Jokic, but still a top 5 player. Compared to and then Kyrie as his backcourt mate. That's a better player than Jamal Murray, right?
100%.
Like we know Kyrie Irving, as good as Jamal Murray is in the playoffs, Kyrie is that good of a player. Period, right? Regular season or playoffs. So that gives you a lot more punch, right? So when Denver's kind of looking to somebody else for a little bit more offense, they don't have it, right?
Right.
Whereas for Dallas, we got not one but two guys who can pretty much score from anywhere on the floor. And again, that's a tough cover. But I think Minnesota can still be up to the challenge. It's just again, just going to come down to, can you make a few adjustments here and there? And then obviously, like on offense, your stars got to get it done. But if, again, if they don't, that's going to be the series right there. Because
Yeah.
usually, in a close series, the best player on the floor usually wins, or at the very least, it's got to be pretty close between the two.
Yeah, 100%. And it's going to be tough. The way that we kind of framed it when we were teeing this whole series up was, it's going to be a battle of the superstars. And, whoever's the better superstar, I think is really going to win this series because it seems like the role players, they're going to be a factor for sure, but just maybe not as big as like a factor as last series for, Dallas. I don't know. That might be like jumping the gun completely. It's one game. But, we think it's going to be a tight competitive series, and that's the way it should be. And I think this is a great tone setter because, I mean, you stole game one, and that's all you really needed to do. And most good series kind of start like that. So it should be interesting.
And I think Dallas, has kind of flown under the radar a little bit in terms of the postseason, where not that they're an unknown, obviously, but it's just kind of interesting, right? Because obviously Minnesota kind of wowed everybody, but Dallas has done some pretty good things in the playoffs as well. They're also a 5 seed, right?
Yes.
Now they got a little bit of luck right in the first round because of Kawhi, right? He didn't play. Even though again we've seen that that's kind of been the norm at this point.
Yeah.
But it's still a fact, right?
Okay.
So I mean, like they I guess you could say they had the easier path than Minnesota, but also like at a certain point, like, if you want to be able to get to the finals and win a title, you're gonna have to beat good teams eventually. So
Yeah.
like, it doesn't matter if Dallas ends up beating Minnesota, you still give them all the credit in the world because again, they went all in at the deadline, they went all in on a star, and it's paid dividends, right? And now this is probably the best team that Luka's had in terms of
Oh, yeah.
the level of talent on both ends of the floor around him. Because that Dallas team that went to the conference finals a couple of seasons ago was a good defensive team, but they didn't have the offensive firepower
It was
that
only Luka.
yeah, like because I guess it was like baby Brunson, right, where he wasn't as good as he is now.
Bro, but he was
Um,
barely doing, like,
well, that's fine.
yeah.
But like because I remember he had a couple of games I think against the Jazz in the first round where like Luca was out and he was balling, but he
Sure.
wasn't the Knicks Brunson. Like it
Sure.
wasn't the same. He wasn't an All NBA, All Star level guy. He was like
Sure.
a nice player to have on your team, but he
He
wasn't.
wasn't a second fiddle at that point.
Yeah, and then who else? It was like Dinwiddie off the bench,
Oh,
Dorian
God.
Finney-Smith, Dwight Powell as the starting center, I think, and
Yeah. Dark
what
times.
Travis Bertans, your
Yeah.
Wizard legend.
Oh, great.
Um,
Yeah, the guy was
Max,
still stealing money from us, but
right. This is the best. This is the best team that Luca's had. So a lot
100%.
of credit. Yeah, so a lot of credit to Dallas for putting this roster together. And to be fair, give credit to Minnesota for putting their roster together because a lot of people clowned that trade when it was done.
Yeah.
A lot of people clowned the decision to put that roster together, and it's paid dividends, right? Because this is the first time they've been to the conference finals in 20 years. And obviously if they lose the series, it'd be rough, but like they're still going to be one of the better teams in the Western Conference as long as Edwards continues and improves on his play.
Yeah. You want to know what I hate? Like,
What?
both of these teams I was so high on last year, and I practically gave up on them going into this season. I was like, F this. I'm not doing this. I give up. And now, like, they're elite, and it's just funny. And to see them come as far as they've come, it's amazing. And, to see them really duke it out and meet up in the middle is amazing as well.
Yeah, and like for me, on the other side of the coin, like Boston was a team that they were actually my initial pick to win the title this year.
Right.
It wasn't Denver.
Right.
And then in the playoffs, I was like, okay, it's probably going to be the Nuggets. And then of course they lose, right? And now Boston has, a relatively easy path to the finals.
Sure.
Not saying they're going to win, but they can, right? Like we know they have a chance.
They're a lot
right?
to get in there.
Yeah, they're a lot. Yeah, they're close to a lock. I mean, we'll see what Indiana does, but I don't think they're going to.
Speaking of Boston, though, should we preview this next game? Because I don't think there's like too much to say, like except for Boston's probably going to win, but expect a little bit of a different game plan. I think.
I don't know because I lean towards like I wonder if it's a blowout. I'm not
Okay.
saying it will be, but I feel like Boston in game 2 will probably come a little bit, more focused, a little
100%.
bit more, I don't know, into it. But then it's like at the same time, like nobody had a problem scoring for most of the game, right? Like obviously Boston's offense kind of melted down at the end, but like at the same time, the defense was really the big issue, right? So I wonder with Boston, I feel like we're probably going to see a better level of intensity on defense,
Hmm.
and then that will probably feed into Boston's offense more,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to like, is it going to continue to be a track meet? Because I just feel like Indiana, like they were so good offensively in that game that you had to win that game.
Right.
Versus like because you could have a game too where you end up coming in and then like it's kind of a stinker on offense, right? Where it's like we kind of expect them, to kind of come in and then they just lose. But Indiana because their offense has been so good, they could have another game like that. I just, again, you got a lot of really good performances from a number of guys. Like Miles Turner was great. Halliburton was great until he, had the brain dead turnovers. Siakam was really good. It just all came apart right at the end. And it was just such a fluky, scenario where it almost just kind of feels like it has to flip in game two, where Boston just locks in and then it's not really as competitive of a game. But I give Indiana a chance though, but I feel like game one was the one that you just that one was you gave it away. And you
Sure.
can never give away games in the playoffs and expect to be usually rewarded with a series win. Because we've seen a lot of times when you give away games in a series, like the basketball gods have a way of punishing you, right? We've seen it. Like we've seen teams have leads in the playoffs and they take their foot off the gas and then like you do it one time and then maybe you do it twice and before you know it the series is over,
Right.
right? Like we've seen that multiple times. So that's something where I feel like if you're Boston, I feel like they're going to be a lot more attentive. But Indiana has a chance. I don't think it's going to be like an overtime back and forth thriller. Like this game will probably end like I don't know. It's maybe like in this like midway through the fourth, but I don't like predicting like what's the actual score is. But I think
Sure.
Boston will win game two.
Yeah, I think Boston's going to win game two, just based on the pattern that we've kind of seen with Indiana, especially based on really the Knicks series as well. Like they really, really cannot close it on the road too well, unless everybody's hobbled. But the Celtics are fairly healthy. You're just missing Porzingis, which is a huge deal. But at the end of the day, I'm also expecting Jason Tatum to kind of carry over his momentum. Like I talked about, I thought this series was going to be the series that Jason Tatum and maybe even like a Jaylen Brown kind of find their footing and then get, back into full rhythm. Because honestly, like I've talked about, their numbers have been a little bit underwhelming. Yes, they've been playing more team basketball, but their individual numbers have been kind of meh, especially efficiency wise. But I think it's on the up and up, which is a good thing if you're a Celtics fan. And at the end of the day, I think they're in two different classes, but there is a pathway for Indiana to beat Boston. It's just you're gonna have to capitalize on Porzingis being out, and I don't know if they can do that.
They're gonna have to win by outscoring Boston. Like that's
Yeah,
pretty much what they're gonna have to do because I don't think they're gonna be able to effectively get consistent
no,
stops against the Celtics. But I
no,
think they can
especially
kind of
Tatum
hang.
and Brown. No,
Yeah, but they can hang with them on offense because they have a lot of. I mean, again, what have they kept saying? They have seven double-digit scorers, right? They
yeah,
have seven guys that average at least 10 a game,
yeah,
which you
they're
don't
elite
normally.
on offense.
Yeah, which you don't normally have in the playoffs, right? Like
Right.
usually you might have like I don't know three, maybe
Sure.
four, right? And then after that you have guys off the bench that don't really do a lot, in terms of scoring.
Yeah.
Um,
But look at what you
but
sacrificed defensively, though. That's the drawback with that. Can't
yeah,
stop anybody.
yeah. So I guess we can all. I kind of want to ask this question too. So like
Sure.
I think we kind of said that like whoever comes out against the Nuggets Wolves series wins the title.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say like if from Boston's perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're Boston,
Mm-hmm.
which team in the West would you rather want to face, right? Like would you rather want to face Minnesota or Dallas, right? And people in the chat, if they want, they can also respond as well. I'd actually be curious to see what people in
Yeah.
the live stream think as well, because
That's
it's kind of something
tough.
to think, right? Because Minnesota and Dallas are different,
Yeah.
but you also kind of wonder, like, okay, like say for Dallas, like their defense is a little bit different than Minnesota's, but
Mm.
then you also factor in like say, you have Jason Tatum for the Celtics, right? As kind of your go-to guy or Jaylen Brown. But then on the other end, you have, either Luca and Kyrie, or you have Edwards, right? And I guess kind of Towns. So I just kind of wonder, like matchup wise, if you're Boston, which team would you prefer? And also, like I guess assuming Porzingis is like pretty available, because I feel like you could make a case for either one.
Yeah.
So so James Wiseman fan says Mav. So he thinks that if you're Boston, you'd rather face Dallas. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's kind of what I was thinking. I think I
Okay.
would say that as well, just because
I
I
think
think
so
you
too.
you
I
have
think
like some, I think players where you feel pretty good about it, like Drew Holiday. I feel very confident in Drew Holiday and Derek White and their defensive ability. Even a guy like Jaylen Brown, I think. But like on Dallas, who's really gonna be able to guard Jason Tatum, bro? If we're talking, peak Jason Tatum, I don't
or
I don't yeah, Jaylen Brown too. Those but you do have to give credit to Dallas because they've been able to form a wall on every big time slasher in the league, and that's been kind of the unexpected factor for sure. And being able to rotate between Lively, Gafford, PJ Washington, like those guys play amazing together, all three of them. But I also think Boston's a little bit deeper. I don't know. That might be a hot take, but because I do like Peyton Pritchard, I do like Hauser, I do like the things that they're able to do. But I
yeah.
would need Porzingis to be present and healthy.
I,
I'm not going into that series picking Boston if Al Horford is my starting center, and that's not a
yeah.
knock on him. It's just like, bro,
No,
we
yeah.
gotta like be ideal about this. Like,
You're right. Yeah, no, yeah. That's why I asked, assuming Porzingis is healthy. I would say
yeah,
Dallas.
yeah.
And it seems like everybody else in the chat, seems to agree.
I don't want to give Edwards the time of the day. I just don't want to give him a chance, bro. Like I wouldn't want to take that chance. I'd rather deal with Luka and Kyrie, which is
Okay.
probably insane to say, but I'd rather deal with Luka and Kyrie considering the personnel that Boston does have versus, maybe Minnesota where they're kind of just towering over you.
Right. Because I think you could make a case for either one. It's just like you said, I think for Dallas, you kind of wonder, like, okay, Boston has a lot of offensive options, and it's like you're gonna have to slow down at least two of those three guys. But
Right.
then even if you do, like you said, a Drew Holiday on both ends of the floor could operate, or Derek White, or even somebody off the bench, right? Like, because and that's kind of the thing when we talked about Boston in the offseason, right? Where it was one of the questions for them was going to be, what does their second unit, or their bench guys look like, right? Because we know the starting five is very good, but do they have enough guys off the bench to be able to kind of, at least come in and be rotational players, right? Because like we were wondering, like, okay, 37, 38-year-old Al Horford, right? Peyton Pritchard, Sam Hauser, and then occasionally, right? Sometimes you'll see Luke Cornett,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or sometimes you'll see, I think in the previous round, and before that, we saw Xavier Tillman a little bit,
Yeah.
right? Now, not all those guys are going to play when Porzingis is there, right? But they're going to switch it up. It's just kind of something to think about. But those guys have played pretty well. So I just wanted to kind of ask the question because I'm just
That was a
curious
good
about it.
question.
Just, yeah, because I think if you're Boston, you could make the case. I mean, if you're Boston, you could say, like, we could beat either team if Porzingis is healthy. It's not that they can't. It's just who would you rather face if you're Boston?
Yeah.
Like, what's the ideal pathway to win? Is it through Dallas? I feel like it probably would be Dallas. So I was just kind of curious.
Yeah.
Um,
100%.
but yeah. But also I guess, kind of last topic, right? All NBA. So good question. Yeah. So All NBA. So what did we think of that? Right? So, they put out the All NBA prior to the game. They had the first, second, and third. I think they also because we talked about it in the last live stream yesterday, right? Because they had defense yesterday. And I think they had the rookies earlier today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or was that yesterday?
Um, I think no, that was 2 days ago. I think
Yeah,
rookies was
okay.
2 days ago.
Right. So now today was All NBA,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they already said that, they mentioned the idea of like Edwards and Halliburton, right? They got those financial bonuses because they got in there. But let's kind of just go through the All NBA and, just kind of, everybody kind of just share, what they thought, right? So we'll go through first team All NBA, right? You have Jokic, SGA, Luca, Giannis, Tatum, right? Second team All NBA, Brunson, AD, Kevin Durant, Edwards, Kawhi Leonard, and then third team All NBA was Booker, Steph, Tyrese Halliburton, LeBron, and Sabonis. Homelander says SGA represent. So, what do we think of that list for the most part? Do we think that for the most part it's pretty spot on, or are we kind of leaning towards like this is bogus? Because I feel like first team All NBA was pretty much like this was locked. Like this was a lock, right? I think we like because we did our our All NBAs, I think, before the season ended,
Hmm.
and we had the same first team All NBA, right?
Yeah.
Second and third is, I think, where it started to get a little bit more interesting, right? Because say like a guy like a Jalen Brown, right? He ended up not getting on here, right? But you could have made a case for it, right? Some people would say, well, they had the best record in the NBA. They won 64 games, so why wouldn't they have two? But then some people would say, no, somebody else should be on here, right? But kind of looking at it, what did you think? Right? Because I think yours was a little bit closer to what it ended up being. Because I had a couple of guys on the list. Like I had Brown on, I think it was third or whatever.
Hmm.
I think it was second or third. But what did you think?
I mean, I thought it was very good. Number one, my favorite part was 11 out of 15 of the All NBA players are from the West. That just tells you how loaded that thing is.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think they made the right picks. Like you said, first team was a lock for sure. I think you can't really argue that one. Those are probably the best top 5 players in the league at this point. But then, you look at All NBA second team, that's where things kind of get a little tricky. I think Jalen Brunson had an elite season, and he definitely continued it with it going into the postseason. I think that's deserved. Anthony Edwards deserved. KD, I think that one's deserved. As much as people want to hate, you can't argue against his comeback story and what he's been able to accomplish numbers wise. Maybe not having the success going into the postseason, but numbers wise, I think he's been amazing considering his situation.
It's also regular season. So
Exactly, and considering his age as well, like he's getting up there. Kawhi, I think that's valid as well. I think he had an underrated season considering he's healthy for the majority of it. Just unfortunate ending. AD, I think probably one of the most, if not the most underrated guy on this list because I think he kind of got a little bit of I don't know what the word is, but I think he kind of got pushed into the background this season
yeah,
in terms of talking about him. He only really got talked about when there was something negative, there was an injury, or if there was something going on in the press conference. Because I thought he was very elite throughout the majority of the season. It's just unfortunate the Lakers kind of, I don't know, they just really blew it up today, or not today, but this regular season. It was bad. Like I don't know, that was a
right.
failure of a season, but not
Yeah.
a failure of a
Yeah.
season from Anthony Davis's perspective. I think he was a monster this season.
Yes.
Let's see. Third team, we got D-Book. I think that one's deserved. I think him playing point guard and being the facilitator this season and still having some very good numbers, I think that was deserved as well. Steph, I think that's probably that's a questionable one, but at the same time, who are you really going to take Steph out for? That's why
Yeah.
that's like I get it. Steph's numbers were lower, but at the end of the day, I'm sorry, it's Steph and Curry. You can't have an All NBA list without Curry being there just because of the fact that he's a shooter.
Yeah. Did you? Because did you have him on your
I
on your
don't
All
know.
NBA?
I can check. Just drive the conversation while I check real quick.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't think I ended up because I think Sabonis was one that I didn't have.
Yeah,
Because I had Jalen Brown, I think, in place of Sabonis.
yeah,
Just and again, like the thing is that with All NBA, it's like what we talked about with All Defense. When we were talking to the Homelander about when he mentioned that he thought Chet got robbed, which was a good point. It's just there's so many talented players in the league right now that we're at a point where somebody's going to get left off the list, right? And like that's just unfortunately that's what's going to happen. I think Halliburton was one that I ended up not having only because the second half of the season I didn't think he was as good. Right?
yeah,
If he played, if his numbers the second half of the season were relatively close to what he was doing in the first half of the season, he would have been probably like first or second All NBA, right? Like maybe not first, but he would have been second.
yeah,
For sure. No lower than second.
yeah,
But I think there was also kind of the factor of they didn't want to necessarily put him in a position where they didn't want him to lose a bunch of money because he ended up, playing a bunch of games that he probably shouldn't have played because he had to play enough games so that way he wouldn't be on, so that way he wouldn't be knocked off the list, right? Because say like Joel Embiid missed too many games, so he's not on the list, right? He would have probably been MVP, obviously first All NBA if he had played, at least 65 games or whatever. But
yeah,
because he missed, so many games, right? He's off the list, right? Donovan Mitchell is another guard who probably would have been on All NBA had it not been for injuries. So it's
Ja
like,
too, potentially.
yeah,
Obviously.
yeah,
Injuries
Ja
and suspension.
right. And I think Zion was one that I had on All NBA third.
Yeah.
I think what some people, but some people maybe just be like, and the first half of the season was kind of a weird,
Yeah.
scenario, and maybe that was kind of the deciding factor because I think that's what I ended up doing. I think it was really the only real difference was I think I had Zion and Jalen Brown in for Steph and Sabonis. But again, it's another scenario where it's like you can interchange the two, to be honest, right?
Sure.
Because it's like, yeah, because like at the end of the day, like when you look at all NBA, it's kind of almost a snapshot of like, okay, top 15 guys in the league, right? Who are they? And like, there's so much talent that there's probably more top 15 players than 15, if that makes
Sure.
sense,
I understand
right?
what you're saying. Like guys who can
Yeah.
be in that caliber, like you wouldn't have a problem putting a Jalen Brown in the top 15. It's just who are you really taking out? That's the issue. But like,
Right.
I had Halliburton on my list, and it's like that the reason why was because of like the first half of the season, and I just thought, he was doing stuff that we hadn't seen. Obviously, the regression was kind of wild, but at the end of the day, he pushed through. I think I couldn't find the freaking document, but I know I had Tyrese Halliburton on there for sure. But Steph,
And
I,
now,
I think I had Steph on there too.
right. So, yeah. And at the end of the day, that's kind of how it goes,
Yeah.
with all NBA, where it's just like, there's always going to end up being somebody that's either going to be in there that shouldn't be in there. Because like the funniest part really is also if you look at the votes, right? Like when they actually show like, who got, X place votes,
Hmm.
like first place, second place, third place. And that's always kind of to me even more interesting than just who got on the list because that's where sometimes you can see like, oh, somebody got, some votes that shouldn't have gotten one, right? Like we saw when we were talking about all defense, right? We saw like Sabonis get like a defensive player of the year vote or whatever, or all defense. And we know that guy's not an all defense type player on defense, right?
Yeah.
And there's others too, but that's always kind of the fun part of looking at some of that. Get Sabonis out of all NBA. I mean, again, he's a really good player.
Underrated this
Um,
year, man.
yeah, he had a really good season. It's just again, what always is going to happen is it's the same thing with MVP, right? Where like somebody wins MVP and then they go out in the first or second round, and then they're like, and then people are like, "See, that guy shouldn't have won MVP," but it's a regular season award, right?
Hmm.
Like it's not. The playoffs aren't a factor at all. And the other thing that we forget is remember now at the end of the conference finals, you do get a trophy, right? There is like a Eastern Conference Finals MVP, Western Conference Finals
Yeah.
MVP trophy, right? Like what is it, the Larry Bird and Magic Johnson
Yeah.
award?
They're trying
And
to make
that's
it more like baseball, where like you win your conference, which is like okay, I guess. But I mean, I think it was better, where the one trophy was the only one that really mattered.
yeah, and I guess the other question is, kind of as like a last question, to pose before we probably wrap it up is, and then maybe it's not quite fair after, one game, but I'm just gonna ask anyways. Who do we think is gonna win? Who do we think is gonna win those, right? So who do you think is gonna win, like Western Conference? I guess you'd also kind of say like, who's winning the series, but I guess let's say the two most likely players to win it in the West and in the East, right? Because I guess for
Okay.
the West, probably like Edwards or Luca.
Okay.
And then in the East, probably like, either Tatum or maybe Brown or Halliburton. But we have to pick one, right?
Okay.
Just to kind of pick one. Who do we think?
Oh God. I mean, it's tough. Like, okay, so if Minnesota wins, right? Anthony Edwards. But
Okay.
if Dallas wins, I might zag here. I'm gonna go Kyrie. I feel
Okay.
like that's probably the pathway. If
So,
the Mavericks win, I think it's going to be because of Kyrie. He has like some
all right.
insane games.
So then if you're picking one, which one are you leaning more towards? Which is more likely?
I mean, I picked Minnesota to win the series, so I'd probably say Anthony
Edwards.
Edwards. Yeah,
Okay. All right. And then in the East, guess probably Tatum, I
Tatum.
guess, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tatum.
Okay.
I think he's gonna
Yeah.
have some monster
Yeah.
games, bro.
So yeah, if anyone in the chat, wants to put that, put a response down there as well,
Yeah,
feel
please let
free
us
to.
know, man.
Yeah, but it's just kind of interesting because again, like it's not an award that I really think about or care about a whole lot, but it is kind of it is an award, right? Like guys will be playing for that, right? And it's kind of funny because like last year, like I think it was in the East, right? Like I think Butler won it, but you could have made a case that Caleb Martin could have won that. James
100%.
Wiseman.
100%.
Okay, so James Wiseman fan says Luca. Okay,
Fair.
so I guess that means you think that the Mavs are going to win this series. Okay.
That's interesting.
Um, yeah, because they're not going to give it to somebody who loses. I mean, I think the only time that happened was Jerry West won Finals MVP, and I think they lost to. I want to say it was Boston. I think it was way back when.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, just kind of an interesting thing because again, it's not an award that I really think about a whole lot, but I'm sure the players, are probably thinking about it. Hopefully it's not a scenario where Jaden McDaniel says I have to win, the Magic Johnson Award, so I'm gonna
Right.
jack up like 30 shots.
Yeah.
Okay, so Homelander says Ant and JT.
That's
I
solid.
feel like yeah. I feel like to be honest, I think the three names that were mentioned are probably the three most likely because
100%.
like usually like obviously role players can swing, games, you know, and series, but also like the stars end up closing it out, right? Like it's probably not going to be PJ Washington or Derek Jones Jr. winning
Right.
the Magic Johnson, or it's probably not going to be you know Luke Cornett winning the Larry Bird Trophy.
Right.
Like maybe that's what they want, maybe, but probably not. Like it's
Right.
it's going to be the stars. But I think it's an interesting zag that you make where you're thinking like it might be Kyrie, that ends up doing it. But I feel like if their numbers are kind of close, I think they're gonna just give it to Luca.
Yeah. That's why I'm expecting some big games out of Kyrie where, he seems like he's taking the whole Anthony Edwards challenge very, very personal. And I think that's a non-starter for this series, which is kind of scary. I think for our pick, I think our pick is potentially, not potentially, is in a lot of danger already.
Yeah.
But at
If
the end of the
Luca and
day, what's
Kyrie
up?
are the two best players on the floor, this series is going
It's a
to
wrap.
end in favor of Dallas, right? Like I'm not gonna sit here and say sweep, right?
Right.
Because we didn't, but I'm saying like like sweeps are very difficult, right? Like this is not going to be a sweep, but
No.
if it becomes very apparent that Luca and Kyrie are just the two best players on the floor, yeah, it's not going to go well for Minnesota.
And
It's
that's
just not.
crazy to think. Like, can you imagine if Dallas makes the? Could you imagine if either of these teams are going to make the finals? One of these two teams is going to make the finals. Like, and that's
Yeah.
actually insane to think about, considering, where we are as a league.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of the interesting thing is that, again, every year the champion has been different, right? Since 2019, right? We've already said it. Like they're all six previous champions, you know, all ended up not going back to back. And I think you also mentioned that they didn't even make it out of round two,
Yeah.
right? So that kind of speaks volumes about how deep the league is. And you could also say because there's more talent, that might be how a team like a Minnesota, is able to kind of get to the conference finals and have a real chance to win, right? Because I
Sure.
don't think going into this, because usually the old adage was usually like you have to have a top five player, in order to make like these type of crazy runs. Not that you can't get to a conference finals, but usually to get to a finals and win it. But if Minnesota did it, that would kind of be an anomaly, right? Because I
Yeah.
don't think people view Edwards as a top five player just yet, right?
He's
Like,
close.
yeah, I think he's getting closer. Because I was in a Twitter space or I guess X space, the other day,
Mhm.
and they were kind of ranking guys, and I think they had like Edwards is like 11, right? But
Really?
obviously, like, yeah, but like if he were to win the title, then he would edge out somebody, and get easily climb into that top 10.
Yeah.
So that's right. And I think part of it, like they're also looking at the criteria of like, well, some of these other guys have also had like, consistent seasons of, high level production.
Sure.
Whereas like with Edwards, like he was obviously already really good, but this is the first year where they're like one of the top seeds,
Okay.
in the
I
end.
mean, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, because it is pretty much his coming out party. I get it though.
But again, it is something to think about where it's like, even if you look at the Knicks with Brunson, right? Like Brunson isn't viewed as like a top five player.
No.
But because he's got such a good complement of players around him, right? They were able to do some things. And again, like not gonna rehash it, right? Again, we already said like if those guys hadn't gotten banged up, I think they'd be here instead of Indiana.
100%.
But
100%.
yeah, because again, like the Knicks were the other team that also went all in, but it didn't work out because they got hurt.
Yeah. And that's the
But
danger.
Yeah, but either way, if you're the Knicks, you still feel way better about the team that you have now than what you had before, right?
Heck
Like,
yeah.
you know, yeah, exactly. Like, and then obviously same for Dallas, right? Like, if you're Dallas, you feel way better about this team, right, than what you had before. Like, because I mean, PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford don't sound like names that are life changers, but for Dallas, they are because those are the exact types of players that they didn't really have, and now and clearly they need, right?
Yeah, and
As
you got Lively in the draft. Shout out to Dallas, bro.
yeah, exactly. And you hit a home run with Lively in the draft. After having a few draft picks, right, that have been kind of, I don't know, mixed bags, right? Like Jaden Hardy has been kind of a mixed bag. Um, and Josh Green, I guess, has been relatively fine, right?
Yeah,
He's been
sure.
fine.
Yeah.
But the Lively one is like that's a real rotational guy that you got to bring in as a rookie. Like that doesn't normally happen, right?
Yeah.
Like last year for the Nuggets, you had Christian Brown, um, and he was a rookie, but his role wasn't quite the same as Lively's.
No.
And that's another team, speaking of which, didn't go all in, right? Because they didn't do anything at the deadline, and they got kind of promptly punished for it, right? And I think it was Kevin O'Connor on The Ringer, right, where he had an article and he talked about, I think it was the GM for the Nuggets, and he talked about the idea of like, yeah, I'm not thinking about winning back to back, but maybe like, 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 5. And I'm like, that's kind of a weird response to give because I would
Yeah,
think
that's a
like if you
cop
have,
out.
yeah, well, I think that was going into the season.
Oh wow,
So
that
yeah,
makes
so
it even worse.
yeah, because I would think if you have a guy like like a Jokic, like you're just gonna be okay with kind of just like sitting out a season. Like, and to be fair, like it's still on us anyways because we thought they would, go back to back. But either way, it's just kind of a surprising thing, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, and again, like what moves were available, I'm not sure, right? But like, how did the James Najee draft pick work out, right? Like he hasn't done anything.
Yeah.
Um, or none of the guys that they drafted this year helped them at all in the playoffs, right? They didn't even really play in the regular season.
Right.
So, and that's kind of the downside of like, just banking on young guys, to kind of just come in and replace certain players where it's like if they're not ready, you don't have an alternative.
Yeah, 100%. Well,
Mhm.
I think we've covered all the bases for today. So thank you everybody who showed up in the live stream. Thank you for all the messages. We appreciate all your support. No live stream until an elimination comes up. So be on the lookout for that. We will have a new episode out on Friday, and we will be recording tomorrow. Once again, thank you for everybody who showed their support. And we will see you guys on the next one.